On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Alexander Reed walked into a coffee shop 3 blocks from his office and saw a ghost. Not a real one. Worse, a living one. Someone who had vanished from his life 3 years ago without a single word. Elena Brooks stood near the counter holding a paper cup, her posture straight, her expression calm. She was not the same woman he remembered. And the way she looked at him, steady, unblinking, carrying something behind her eyes, told him immediately that this moment was not an accident. Some secrets don't destroy the past. They rewrite the entire future. Alexander Reed lived by structure. Every morning he woke at 5:15. He made coffee black, no sugar. He reviewed emails before his son woke up. By 6:40, he had breakfast on the table. By 7:10, he dropped Oliver at school. By 7:50, he was in his corner office on the 32nd floor of a commercial tower in Midtown Manhattan. He ran a large-scale corporate services firm, consulting, compliance, strategic advisory, 87 employees across 2 offices. His name was on the building directory. His reputation was clean. His record was spotless. At 39, Alexander Reed was the kind of man people described with words like disciplined, reliable, and unshakable. He accepted those words the way a wall accepts paint, without reaction, without gratitude. His wife Margaret had died 4 years ago. Brain aneurysm, no warning, no goodbye. One evening she was reading Oliver a bedtime story. The next morning she was gone. Alexander did not fall apart. That was what people said about him, and they meant it as a compliment. He arranged the funeral within 48 hours. He returned to the office within a week. He hired a nanny. He restructured his schedule. He kept Oliver's life as stable as he could. He never once cried in front of anyone. What no one understood was that Alexander didn't hold himself together out of strength. He did it because he didn't know any other way. Grief to him was a room he had locked from the outside, and he had thrown away the key so long ago that he'd forgotten the room existed. He ran his company the same way he ran his life. Clean, controlled, efficient. He was respected, but not loved. Trusted, but not close. His colleagues admired his precision. His employees feared his silence more than his words. Oliver was 7 now, a quiet boy with dark hair and serious eyes. He asked questions Alexander didn't know how to answer, not about math or science, but about feelings. "Dad, do you ever get lonely?" Oliver had asked once, sitting at the dinner table, his fork resting on his plate. She sat in a shared workspace on the 14th floor, processed audit reports, flagged discrepancies, and never once raised her voice in a meeting. She had the kind of presence that most senior executives forgot within minutes of leaving the room. Alexander had noticed her, though. Not personally, he wasn't that kind of man, but professionally. She was sharper than her title suggested. She caught errors no one else caught. She asked questions in emails that were too intelligent for her pay grade. He had once forwarded one of her reports to his operations director with a note, "Who wrote this?" The answer came back, Elena Brooks, Level 2 analyst. Then one day she was gone. No resignation letter, no 2-week notice. Just an empty desk and a terminated access badge. HR filed it as a voluntary departure. Alexander had asked once briefly in passing and was told she had personal reasons. He accepted that without digging further. People left. That was how companies worked. He never thought about it again. Until now. She stood near the window of the coffee shop wearing a dark coat, her hair pulled back. She was not the nervous young woman he vaguely remembered from conference rooms and hallway nods. There was something settled about her now, something still. She held herself like a person who had been through something and come out the other side not unscathed, but intact. Their eyes met. Elena didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't smile politely and pretend she hadn't seen him. She held his gaze for a full 3 seconds, long enough for Alexander to feel something unfamiliar shift in his chest. He walked toward her, not because he wanted to, because walking away would have required him to acknowledge that he was avoiding something, and Alexander Reed did not avoid things. He managed them. "Elena," he said. "Alexander." Her voice was even. No warmth, no hostility. Just his name spoken like a fact. "It's been a while." 3 years, she said. She didn't add anything. No apology, no explanation. Just the number precise and bare. He stood there holding his coffee. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was loaded, the kind of quiet that sits on top of something neither person is willing to name. "You look well," he said, because that was what people said. "I am well." She paused. "Are you?" He almost said yes automatically. But something in the way she asked, not casually, not politely, but with a directness that cut through every scripted response he had made him hesitate. "I'm fine," he said, half a beat too late. Elena looked at him. Then she set her cup down on the table beside her. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "Not here. Somewhere private. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." Alexander's first instinct was to decline. He didn't do unscheduled conversations. He didn't do something I should have told you. He did agendas, calendars, and controlled environments. But there was something in her tone, not pleading, not dramatic, just certain. Like a person who had carried a weight for years and had finally decided where to set it down. "About what?" he asked. "About why I left." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I assumed it was personal." "It was," Elena said, "but not the way you think." She reached into her bag and pulled out a card, plain white with a phone number handwritten on it. "If you want to know," she said, "call me. If you don't, that's fine too, but I think you should." She held the card out. Alexander looked at it. He had spent 3 years not thinking about Elena Brooks. He had spent 3 years not thinking about a lot of things. He took the card. Elena picked up her coffee, nodded once, and walked out of the shop. No lingering, no backward glance, just a clean exit, the kind that leaves a silence heavier than any words. Alexander stood there for a long time, staring at the handwriting on the card. Neat. Precise. Like the reports she used to write. He put it in his jacket pocket. That night, after Oliver was asleep, he sat alone in his study. The card lay on his desk, face up. The number stared at him like a question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. He thought about the woman he had seen today, the calm in her eyes, the weight behind her words. He thought about the girl she had been 3 years ago, quiet, competent, invisible. He thought about the space between those two versions of her and what might have filled it. He picked up his phone. He dialed the number. It rang twice. "I want to know," he said. On the other end, Elena let out a breath, not of relief, but of resignation, the kind of breath a person takes before pulling a thread they know will unravel everything. "Then we need to meet," she said. "Tomorrow. I'll send you the address." She hung up before he could respond. Alexander set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way ice cracks beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Invisible, irreversible. He had spent years building a life on silence and control. He had no way of knowing that a single phone call had just set all of it in motion. The address Elena sent led to a small rented office space in the West Village, the kind of place freelancers and independent consultants used by the hour. It was on the second floor of an old brownstone above a bookstore that smelled like dust and aging paper. Alexander arrived 12 minutes early because that was who he was. He sat in a wooden chair near the window, watching the street below, and told himself he was here out of professional courtesy. A former employee wanted to explain her departure. That was all. He would listen, respond appropriately, and move on. He had done this kind of thing before, controlled transactional clean. Elena arrived exactly on time. She wore a dark sweater and carried a worn leather bag over one shoulder. She didn't apologize for making him wait, because she hadn't. She set the bag down, took the chair across from him, and placed a manila folder on the table between them. It was thin, maybe 5 or 6 pages inside, but Alexander noticed that her fingers lingered on it for a moment, before she let go the way a person holds on to something they've been carrying for too long. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the coffee shop level, direct, stripped of anything unnecessary. "I know this isn't how you usually spend your mornings." Alexander nodded but said nothing. He had already decided to let her lead, not out of generosity but out of strategy. He wanted to hear what she had to say before he decided how much of it mattered. Elena looked at him across the table, and for a moment something shifted behind her eyes. Not doubt, but the kind of resolve that comes right before a person steps off a ledge they've been standing on for years. "3 years ago I left your company without explanation," she began. "You probably assumed it was personal, or that I couldn't handle the work, or that I simply found something better." She let those possibilities sit in the air for a moment. "None of that is true." Alexander kept his expression neutral. He had been trained by years of boardrooms and negotiations to reveal nothing before he understood the full picture. But something in the back of his mind had already begun to tighten, like a rope being pulled from both ends. Elena opened the folder and slid a single document across the table. It was a printed copy of an internal audit report dated 3 years and 4 months ago, stamped with the company's compliance seal. Alexander recognized the format immediately. It was one of his firm's standard deliverables, the kind sent to clients at the end of a quarterly review cycle. He picked it up and scanned it. The client name at the top was Graves and Whitfield, a mid-size investment group that had been one of his firm's largest accounts at the time. The numbers looked familiar. The signatures at the bottom looked familiar. But there was something else, a handwritten annotation in the margin circled in red ink that he did not remember ever seeing before. "Page 3, Elena said quietly. Alexander turned to page 3. The annotation read, "Discrepancy flagged asset valuation overstated by 11%. Original figures adjusted per senior directive. Revised version submitted to client without secondary review." The handwriting was not his. It was not Elena's either. But the phrase "senior directive" sent a cold, precise shock through his chest because he knew exactly what it referred to. "I found this during a routine cross-check," Elena said. The original report showed a significant overstatement in the client's asset portfolio. The numbers had been adjusted inflated before the final version was sent out. "When I traced the revision history, the change was authorized under your approval code." She was not accusing him. She was reciting facts the way she used to in her reports, clean, methodical, impossible to argue with. "I brought it to your operations director at the time, a man named Richard Callaway. I told him the report had been altered and that the client was receiving inaccurate data. I expected him to escalate it. Instead, he told me the revision had been approved at the executive level and that I should drop it." Alexander set the document down. His jaw was tight. He remembered Graves and Whitfield. He remembered the pressure that quarter the firm had been stretched thin, 2 major clients had pulled out, and the board was pushing for stronger numbers. He remembered Richard Callaway coming into his office with a revised report saying the figures had been reconciled. He remembered signing off on it without reading every page, because he trusted his team, because he was buried in other fires, because that was how things got done when the ground was shifting beneath you. He remembered all of it, except what happened next. "What did you do?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than he intended. Elena met his eyes. "I filed an internal concern through the compliance channel, anonymous the way the system was designed, but the system wasn't as anonymous as it claimed. Within 2 weeks, Callaway knew it was me. He called me into his office and told me that, if I pushed this further, the discrepancy would be reframed as my error, a junior analyst who miscalculated the original figures, forcing a correction that I then tried to dispute out of embarrassment. She folded her hands on the table. He had the documentation to support it. He had already altered the revision trail, and he made it very clear that if it came down to his word against mine, no one in that building would choose mine. Alexander felt the floor beneath him shift, not physically, but in the way a man feels when the story he has told himself for years suddenly develops a crack he cannot unsee. He had trusted Callaway. He had relied on him. He had never once questioned the internal operations of his own compliance department, because that was the entire point of having people like Callaway, so that he didn't have to. "So you left," Alexander said. "I left," Elena confirmed. "But not before Callaway made sure my name was attached to the error in every internal record that mattered. My performance file was flagged. My references were poisoned. I couldn't get hired at any firm in the same sector for over a year. I worked retail for 8 months. I lost my apartment. I moved in with my sister in New Jersey and spent 6 months wondering if I had made the right choice." She said all of this without self-pity, without trembling. She said it the way a person describes weather, something that happened, something that was survived. "I didn't come to you then because I thought you already knew. I thought you had approved all of it. The falsified report, the cover-up, Callaway's response. I thought you were the one pulling the strings." "I wasn't," Alexander said immediately, and the words came out harder than he expected, defensive, almost sharp. "I know that now," Elena said. "It took me a long time to figure that out. But I did. I spent the last year going through everything I could access, old emails, timestamps, filing records. Your approval code was on the revised report, but the revision itself was initiated by Callaway. He used your credentials during a window when you were out of the office. You signed the final version, but you never saw the original. You didn't know what had been changed." She looked at him steadily. "You weren't corrupt, Alexander. You were careless, and that carelessness cost me everything." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Careless. Alexander Reed, the man who built his life on control, on precision, on never leaving a thread loose, had been careless, and someone else had paid for it. Not a company, not a client, a person. A 27-year-old woman who had done the right thing and been destroyed for it while he went home every night to his son, and his silence, and his clean conscience. He sat with that for a long time. The room was quiet. The folder lay open between them like a wound neither of them could close. Elena watched him without expectation. She had not come here to be rescued. She had not come here to cry. She had come here to set something down, a truth she had been carrying alone for 3 years, and whether he picked it up or not was his decision. "What do you want from me?" Alexander asked, and even as he said it, he hated how transactional the question sounded. But he didn't know how else to operate. His entire life was built on identifying the ask and delivering the response. Elena shook her head slightly, as if the question itself was the problem. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I wanted you to know what happened. That's it. What you do with it is yours." Alexander stood up. He walked to the window. Below the street moved on taxis, pedestrians, a woman pushing a stroller. The world didn't know. The world didn't care. And for a moment that felt like a mercy because the alternative was terrifying. If this came out, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. A falsified audit report sent to a major client under his firm's name. Even if Callaway was the one who altered the data, Alexander's signature was on the final document. His approval code authorized the revision. In the eyes of regulators, clients, and the public, he was responsible. The firm's reputation, built over a decade of meticulous work, would collapse. His name would be dragged through investigations, potential lawsuits, and the kind of media coverage that no amount of damage control could fix. He turned back to Elena. If this gets out, he said slowly, it doesn't just affect me. It affects 87 employees, their families, their livelihoods. You understand that. Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened, not with anger, but with recognition. She had heard this argument before, maybe not in these exact words, but in the same shape. The shape of a powerful person explaining why the truth was too expensive. I'm not threatening to expose anything, she said. I didn't come here with a lawyer or a reporter. I came here with a folder and the truth. What you do with that is your choice. She stood up, picked up her bag, and left the folder on the table. But I want you to understand something, Alexander. I spent 3 years living with the consequences of your carelessness. I lost my career. I lost my confidence. I lost years of my life rebuilding something that should never have been broken. And the whole time you were here, running your company, raising your son, being the man everyone admires. Not because you earned it. Because someone else paid the price so you didn't have to. Alexander stared at the folder. His mind was already running calculations, risk assessment, exposure, analysis, containment strategies. It was instinct. It was what he did. Every problem had a solution. Every crisis had a containment plan. And every truth had a version that could be managed. He could bury this. Callaway had left the company 2 years ago, relocated to Chicago. The original records were archived. Elena had copies, but no legal standing. She had never filed a formal complaint outside the company's internal system. If he did nothing, the world would continue as it was. His reputation would remain intact. His company would keep running. His son would never have to know. I'm sorry for what happened to you, he said. The words were measured, careful, chosen. But I can't undo the past, and I'm not going to destroy everything I've built, everything my employees depend on, because of a mistake that happened 3 years ago under someone else's watch. He said it the way he said everything, with the quiet authority of a man who believed that control was the same as integrity. Elena looked at him for a long moment. There was no surprise in her face, no disappointment even. Just a tired clarity, like a person watching a door close that they always knew would never open. I didn't expect you to say anything different, she said softly. But I needed to hear you say it. I needed to know if the man I protected for 3 years was worth the silence. She picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder. Now I know. She walked to the door, and this time there was a finality in her steps that hadn't been there before. Not the clean, composed exit of the coffee shop, but the slow, deliberate walk of someone leaving a place they would never return to. Alexander didn't stop her. He stood in the rented office space, alone with the folder still open on the table and the sound of her footsteps fading down the staircase. The brownstone settled into silence around him. He picked up the document, looked at his own approval code printed at the bottom of the page, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt the walls of the room he had locked years ago begin to groan under pressure. He could no longer ignore. He put the folder in his briefcase. He walked out. He went back to work. He told himself it was over. But the crack that had started the night before, invisible, irreversible, had just split wide open. For 3 days, Alexander Reed functioned exactly as he always had. He arrived at the office before 8. He chaired meetings. He signed documents. He answered calls. He picked Oliver up from school and made dinner and helped with homework and read bedtime stories the way he did every night, methodical, present in body, absent in everything else. The folder sat in the bottom drawer of his desk at home, underneath a stack of old tax returns where no one would ever find it. He had decided to move on. The decision was rational, defensible, and final. Except it wasn't, because on the 3rd night, Oliver asked him a question that broke something Alexander didn't know was still intact. They were sitting at the kitchen table finishing a quiet dinner of pasta and grilled chicken. Oliver had been talking about a problem at school. A boy in his class had cheated on a test, and the teacher had asked the whole class to come forward if they knew anything. Most of the kids stayed silent. Oliver had raised his hand. I told the truth. Dad, Oliver said, looking across the table with those serious dark eyes that sometimes reminded Alexander so much of Margaret, it physically hurt. I told Mrs. Patterson what I saw. Some kids got mad at me, but I still told the truth, because that's what you said, that even when it's hard, you always tell the truth. Right. Alexander looked at his son, 7 years old, sitting in a kitchen chair with his feet barely touching the floor, still believing that the world made sense, still believing that the man sitting across from him was someone worth imitating. And in that moment, Alexander felt the full weight of his own hypocrisy land on his chest like a steel beam. He had spent years teaching Oliver about honesty, about integrity, about standing up for what was right even when it cost you something. He had built an entire parenting philosophy around those words. And now, sitting in his own kitchen, he realized that every single one of those lessons was a lie, not because he didn't believe them, but because when the moment came to live them, he had chosen to protect himself instead. "That's right, buddy," he said to Oliver, and the words tasted like ash. Oliver smiled, satisfied, and went back to eating. Alexander stared at his plate and felt the walls of that locked room, the one he had sealed shut after Margaret died, the one where he kept everything he was too afraid to feel, begin to buckle. That night, after Oliver was asleep, Alexander pulled the folder from the bottom drawer and sat with it at his desk for over an hour. He read the document again. He looked at his approval code at the bottom of the page. He thought about Elena Brooks, not the calm, composed woman who had sat across from him in the West Village, but the 27-year-old analyst who had done the right thing and been punished for it. He thought about the 8 months she spent working retail, the apartment she lost, the career that was taken from her, the 3 years she spent believing he had been part of it. And he thought about what she had said before she walked out. "I needed to know if the man I protected for 3 years was worth the silence. Now I know." She had looked at him and seen exactly what he was, a man who would sacrifice someone else's truth to preserve his own image. And the worst part was that she hadn't been wrong. That was exactly what he had done. Not 3 years ago when he signed a report without reading it, not when Callaway rewrote the records and destroyed a young woman's career. But 3 days ago in that rented office, when Elena handed him the truth and he chose to look away. That was the moment that mattered. That was the moment he became the man she had always feared he was. Alexander closed the folder and leaned forward in his chair, pressing his palms against his eyes. He had spent 4 years since Margaret's death convincing himself that discipline was the same as virtue, that control was the same as courage, that keeping everything in order meant everything was fine. But nothing was fine. He was a man who taught his son to tell the truth and then buried the evidence when it was his turn to do the same. He was a man who had locked every uncomfortable feeling behind a steel door and called it strength. He was a man who had let a woman carry his burden for 3 years, and then, when she finally set it down in front of him, told her it wasn't his problem. The realization didn't come as a dramatic epiphany. It came as a slow, grinding collapse, like a building settling into its own foundation, floor by floor, until there was nothing left standing but the frame. Alexander sat in his study alone, and for the first time since Margaret died, he did not try to hold himself together. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply sat in the wreckage of his own self-image and let the silence tell him what he had been refusing to hear for years: that survival was not the same as living, that control was not the same as integrity, and that the man Oliver believed him to be did not yet exist. The next morning, Alexander called his attorney. He disclosed the contents of the folder, the falsified audit report, the role of Richard Callaway, and his own signature on the final document. His attorney listened without interruption, and then told him in careful legal language that going public with this would trigger regulatory scrutiny, potential civil liability from Graves and Whitfield, and irreparable damage to the firm's reputation. Alexander told him to begin the process anyway. His attorney asked if he was sure. Alexander said he was. Over the following week, Alexander initiated a formal internal review of all reports filed during Callaway's tenure. He contacted Graves and Whitfield, directly disclosed the discrepancy in the original audit, and offered full cooperation in any independent review they chose to conduct. He informed his board of directors in a closed session, presenting the evidence without excuses, without deflection, and without minimizing his own role. He did not blame Callaway alone. He told them what Elena had told him, that he had been careless, that his carelessness had consequences, and that those consequences had been borne by someone who deserved better. The fallout was immediate. 2 board members called for his resignation. A third demanded a full forensic audit of every client engagement from the past 5 years. The firm's stock of trust, built over a decade, began to erode within days. Industry contacts stopped returning calls. A trade publication ran a brief item about internal irregularities at his firm. Alexander absorbed all of it without flinching, not because he was strong, but because he understood for the first time that absorbing consequences was different from avoiding them. Then he went to find Elena, not through a phone call, not through an intermediary. He found her address through the records she had left behind and drove to a small apartment in Jersey City on a Saturday afternoon. When she opened the door, she looked at him with the same steady gaze she always had, but this time there was something behind it that resembled surprise, not shock, just the quiet recognition that something had changed. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness," Alexander said, standing on her doorstep. "I don't deserve it, and I'm not going to pretend that anything I do now can undo what happened to you." Elena leaned against the doorframe, watching him. She didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. "I came to tell you that I disclosed everything," he continued. "The report, the cover-up, my signature. I told my board, my attorney, and the client. It's done." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is a formal letter from my firm acknowledging that the internal complaint you filed 3 years ago was valid, that you were wrongfully retaliated against, and that the company bears full responsibility for the damage to your career. It's signed by me and witnessed by my legal counsel. You can use it however you want for future employment, for legal action, for anything. It belongs to you." Elena took the envelope. She held it in both hands and looked down at it for a long moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. She had spent 3 years earning the right not to cry in front of this man, and she was not about to give that up now. "Why?" she asked, not accusingly, just simply the way a person asks when they genuinely want to understand. Alexander thought about Oliver sitting at the kitchen table, feet dangling above the floor, telling him about the boy who cheated and the truth that cost him something. He thought about Margaret, who would have seen through him in a second, who would have handed him the folder herself and told him to fix it before dinner. He thought about the man he had been and the man he wanted to become, and the distance between those two people that suddenly felt both enormous and crossable. "Because my son told me the truth matters," Alexander said, "and I realized I'd been teaching him something I hadn't learned myself." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once slowly, and it was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Alexander had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Eat your vegetables." That was the shape of Alexander Reed's life. A structure built on discipline and avoidance, held together by routine, justified by responsibility. And it might have stayed that way forever if he hadn't walked into that coffee shop. He almost didn't recognize her. 3 years ago, Elena Brooks had been 27, a junior analyst in his compliance division. Quiet, efficient. The acknowledgement that he had finally done something she had waited 3 years to see, and that it had come too late to undo the damage, but not too late to mean something. She did not return to his company. She did not step into his life as a partner or a friend or anything that could be defined by a word. What happened between them was simpler and harder than any of those things. It was two people standing on opposite sides of a wound, choosing not to pretend it didn't exist. Alexander went back to New York and faced the consequences of his disclosure. Some clients left. Some employees lost faith. The firm survived, but smaller, humbler stripped of the polish that had once made it untouchable. And Alexander discovered that a smaller life, honestly built, weighed less than the empire he had been carrying on a fractured foundation. Oliver never learned the full details of what happened. He was 7. There would be time for that later. But he noticed something different about his father. In the weeks that followed, a softness that hadn't been there before, a willingness to sit with questions, instead of solving them, a habit of saying, "I don't know," without treating it like failure. One evening, while they were washing dishes together, Oliver looked up at him and said, "Dad, you seem different." Alexander dried a plate and set it on the counter. "I am different," he said. And for the first time, it was the truth. Some secrets don't make us stronger, but facing them does. Growing up isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the courage to take responsibility when you do.